I honestly couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the footage from the ER that night. I was expecting a typical day at a busy hospital, but what I witnessed was a nightmare. I watched the most powerful chief surgeon in the city lose his mind and literally yank a quiet, defenseless nurse by her hair in front of everyone. Before we dive into this incredible 5-hour journey of power, revenge, and a love that defies the odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Also, I'd love to know who I'm talking to. Comment down below and let me know which city or country you're watching from. The ER was chaotic, but Sarah moved like a ghost. She was the best nurse in the city, yet she never spoke unless she had to. Dr. Miller, the chief surgeon, was failing a surgery and looking for someone to blame. In a fit of blind rage, he grabbed Sarah by her ponytail and yanked her head back, screaming that she was too slow with the tools. He didn't notice the man in the corner bed, a man with a dragon tattoo peeking out from his sleeve, watching with cold, murderous eyes. Jean, the most feared underground leader in the city, had been brought in for a minor wound. He saw the tears welling in Sarah's eyes as she stood her ground, refusing to cry out. Jean felt a protective rage he hadn't felt in years. When Dr. Miller finally let go, Jean stood up, his four-pole rattling like a warning bell. The entire room went silent as the most dangerous man in the room walked toward the arrogant doctor. Jean didn't use a weapon. He used his presence. He stood inches from Miller's face and told him that if he ever touched Sarah again, he would lose the hands he used for surgery. Miller laughed, thinking Jean was just a common criminal, but the hospital's security team refused to step in. They knew who Jean was. Sarah tried to de-escalate the situation, her voice trembling as she begged Jean to sit back down for his own safety. That night, Sarah walked to her car in the dark parking lot, feeling more alone than ever. Suddenly, a black SUV pulled up beside her. Jean stepped out, looking different without the hospital gown. He handed her a small box containing high-end silk hair ties. He told her that her hair was too beautiful to be handled by a coward. Sarah was terrified of him, yet for the first time in years, she felt seen. Back inside the hospital, Miller was furious that a thug had embarrassed him. He began plotting to get Sarah fired, unaware that Jin's men were already monitoring his every move. Miller started assigning Sarah double shifts and giving her the most dangerous patients. He wanted to break her spirit. He didn't realize that every time he mistreated her, he was signing his own professional death warrant. Sarah lived in a tiny apartment and took care of her sick younger brother. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She didn't know that Jean had already bought the debt on her brother's medical bills. Jean watched her from a distance, admiring her strength. He saw her give her own lunch to a homeless patient. He realized she wasn't just a nurse. She was an angel trapped in a lion's den. The first hour ends with a shocking revelation. As Miller prepares to humiliate Sarah in front of the hospital board, the doors swing open. Jean walks in, wearing a three-piece suit that costs more than Miller's house. He isn't there as a patient. He reveals that he just purchased the entire hospital. Miller's face turns white as Jean points to Sarah and says, "She is now your boss." The power dynamic flipped instantly. Sarah didn't want the power, but she needed the protection. Jean forced Miller to work under Sarah's supervision, making him do the tasks he used to mock. The hospital staff, who used to ignore Sarah, now tripped over themselves to help her. But Sarah felt uneasy. She didn't want a boss title. She just wanted to save lives. She confronted Jean in his office, telling him she wouldn't be his puppet. Jean was amused by her defiance. He told her he didn't want a puppet. He wanted her to be safe. He shared a small piece of his childhood, explaining that his own mother was a nurse who died because she didn't have anyone to protect her. This was the first time Sarah saw the man behind the monster. The tension between them shifted from fear to a slow-burning attraction. They were from two different worlds, but both knew what it felt like to be discarded. Miller wasn't finished. He knew he couldn't beat Jean head-on, so he contacted a rival gang that wanted Jean dead. He told them that Jean had a weakness, the quiet nurse. This put a target on Sarah's back. While she was walking home, a group of men tried to snatch her. Before they could touch her, Jin's shadows appeared from the darkness. The fight was over in seconds, but Sarah saw the violence Jean was capable of. Sarah was horrified by the blood on the pavement. She told Jean she couldn't be around him if this was his life. Jean looked at his blood-stained hands and felt a deep shame. He tried to stay away from her for a week, but he couldn't stop checking the security cameras. He saw Sarah struggling with a difficult patient and wanted to help, but he stayed in the shadows. He realized he was falling for her, which was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a man in his position. The hospital held a charity gala, and Jean insisted Sarah attend. She showed up in a simple but elegant dress, looking like royalty. Miller saw an opportunity to embarrass her by bringing up her father's past, a man who had been a disgraced doctor. The room began to whisper, and Sarah felt herself shrinking. Just as she was about to run out, Jean took the microphone. He didn't defend her father. He talked about her character. Jean announced that he was naming a new wing of the hospital after Sarah. The donors clapped, but Sarah felt overwhelmed. She stepped out onto the balcony for air, and Jean followed her. Under the moonlight, he told her he didn't care about her past. He leaned in as if to kiss her, but then his phone buzzed. His face went stone cold. One of his warehouses had been hit, and he knew Miller was the leak. The hour ends with a terrifying twist. Sarah returns to her apartment to find her brother missing. On the kitchen table is a note from Miller's new friends. It says if she wants to see her brother alive, she has to bring Jean to a specific location, alone and unarmed. Sarah realizes that her kindness has led her into the middle of a war, and she has to decide between the man she's starting to love and the brother she's always protected. Sarah's heart felt like it was exploding in her chest as she stared at the empty bed where her brother should have been. She called Jean, her voice a broken whisper, telling him about the note. Jean didn't yell. He became deathly quiet, a silence more terrifying than any scream. He told her to stay put, but Sarah knew Miller was behind this. She realized that being quiet wouldn't save her brother. She grabbed her medical kit and a heavy flashlight, stepping out into the night to meet the monsters on her own terms. Jin's men flooded the streets, but the rival gang was smart. They moved through the underground tunnels where cameras couldn't see. Jean felt a pang of regret for bringing Sarah into his world, but he also felt a surge of pride when he tracked her phone and saw she was already moving toward the ransom point. He realized she wasn't a victim. She was a fighter. He gave the order to his commanders, "Take the rivals down, but leave Dr. Miller for me." Sarah arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the docks. She found Miller standing there, looking disheveled and manic, holding a scalpel. He wasn't a surgeon anymore. He was a man who had lost his mind. He told Sarah that she had ruined his life by taking his status. He pointed to a locked room where her brother was tied up. Miller didn't want money. He wanted to see Sarah crawl. He ordered her to sign a confession saying she had framed him for malpractice. Just as Sarah picked up the pen, the lights in the warehouse flickered and died. A low, rhythmic thumping sound echoed against the metal walls. It was Jin's boots. He walked into the center of the room, completely unarmed, just as the note had asked. Miller laughed and pulled a gun, but his hand was shaking. Jean didn't stop walking. He told Miller that a man who uses a gun to fight a woman is no man at all. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Outside, a massive shootout erupted between Jin's loyal soldiers and the rival gang. The sound of gunfire was like thunder, but inside the warehouse, it was a psychological war. Sarah saw her opening. While Miller was distracted by Jin's cold stare, she threw her heavy medical kit at Miller's head. It struck him square in the face. Jean moved like lightning, disarming Miller and pinning him against the wall by his throat, his eyes glowing with a dark, primal fury. Jean didn't kill Miller. Instead, he forced him to watch as his men rescued Sarah's brother. Jean leaned into Miller's ear and told him that death was too easy. He was going to make sure Miller spent the rest of his life in a place where doctor meant nothing. Sarah ran to her brother, sobbing as she cut his zip ties. She looked up at Jean, seeing the monster he had to be to protect her, and for the first time, she didn't look away in fear. The hour ends with Sarah and her brother being driven to a safe house, a massive estate owned by Jean. As they pulled through the gates, Sarah realized she could never go back to her old, simple life. She was now the queen of a dark empire, whether she wanted to be or not. But as she watched Gene bandage his own wounds in the rearview mirror, she realized she didn't want to be anywhere else. The predator had become her protector. Life at the estate was a gilded cage. Sarah's brother was getting the best medical care in the world, but Sarah felt the weight of Jin's lifestyle pressing down on her. Every meal was checked for poison, and every window was bulletproof. She began to treat the wounds of Jin's men, becoming the underground doctor for his organization. She saw the scars these men carried, not just on their skin, but on their souls. She started to realize that Gene wasn't just a criminal, he was a man holding a fractured world together. Dr. Miller, now a fugitive, had managed to escape police custody during a transport gone wrong. He was hiding in the slums, fueled by a cocktail of drugs and pure hatred. He started sending Sarah gifts at the hospital, dead flowers, surgical masks soaked in red paint, and photos of her taken from the bushes. The psychological torture was working. Sarah started jumping at every shadow, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold a syringe at work. Gene noticed her decline and decided to take her away for a weekend to a secluded mountain cabin. For 48 hours, the phones were off. They cooked together, walked through the woods, and spoke about their dreams. Gene confessed he wanted to go legit and turn his businesses into a legal tech empire, but his past wouldn't let him go. Sarah kissed him for the first time, a slow, desperate moment that sealed their fate. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was two broken people finding a way to fit together. The peace was shattered when Jin's second-in-command, a man he trusted like a brother, arrived with bad news. A traitor within the organization had given Miller the location of the safe house where Sarah's brother was staying. Gene realized the war wasn't just coming from the outside, it was an infection from within. He had to return to the city to purge his own ranks. He left Sarah at the cabin with a small guard, promising to return by dawn. While Gene was gone, the cabin came under siege. It wasn't a gang attack, it was a tactical strike. Sarah realized the traitor wasn't just some low-level thug. It was the very head of security who was supposed to be protecting her. She watched through the security monitors as her guards were taken out one by one. She didn't hide in the closet. She went to the kitchen, grabbed a set of knives, and remembered everything Gene had taught her about the anatomy of a strike. The traitor entered the cabin, calling Sarah's name in a mocking tone. He thought she was just a quiet nurse who would cower and cry. He didn't know that Sarah had spent years in the ER handling the most violent patients in the city. She used the darkness of the cabin to her advantage, setting a trap using medical supplies. When the traitor stepped into the kitchen, she triggered a burst of pressurized oxygen that blinded him, then she struck with the precision of a surgeon. The hour ends with Gene racing back to the cabin, fearing the worst. He burst through the door, gun drawn, only to find the traitor tied to a chair, incapacitated with professional-grade sutures. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking a glass of water, her scrubs stained with blood but her expression calm. Gene realized then that he didn't need to protect her. She was his equal. But the real twist came when the traitor's phone buzzed with a message from Miller. The bomb is already under the hospital. The drive to the hospital was a blur of sirens and screeching tires. Gene pushed the car to its limit, his face a mask of cold fury, while Sarah coordinated with the night shift nurses over the phone. She didn't panic. She gave clear, sharp orders to evacuate the pediatric wing first. Miller had planted the bomb to destroy the one place Sarah loved, proving that if he couldn't be a great surgeon there, nobody could. The hospital was full of innocent lives, and the clock on the detonator was ticking down from 60 minutes. When they arrived, the building was a scene of pure terror. Patients were being wheeled out on gurneys into the cold night air, but the basement, where the main gas lines and the bomb were located, was locked down by Miller's remaining hired goons. Jin's men engaged in a fierce hallway battle, clearing a path for Sarah. She insisted on going down because she knew the layout of the maintenance tunnels better than anyone. Gene tried to stop her, but she looked him in the eye and told him that she saved lives, and tonight was no different. They found Miller in the boiler room, sitting cross-legged next to a massive device wired into the building's core. He looked skeletal, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He held the remote detonator like a holy relic. He told Jean to drop his weapon, or he'd blow the whole block to Kingdom Come. Jean dropped his gun, raising his hands in a rare show of surrender. The tension was suffocating. The sound of the ticking timer echoed off the concrete walls like a heartbeat. Sarah didn't look at the gun or the bomb. She looked at Miller. She used her nursing voice, the calm, steady tone she used to soothe dying patients. She started talking to him about his first successful surgery, calling him by his title, Chief. For a second, the light of the doctor he used to be flickered in his eyes. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button. He wanted the respect he had lost, and Sarah was the only one giving it to him. While Sarah distracted him with the ghost of his ego, Jean moved with a silence that defied physics. He didn't go for Miller. He went for the wires. With a pair of surgical scissors Sarah had slipped him, Jean cut the primary lead just as Miller realized he was being played. Miller screamed and pressed the button, but nothing happened. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the world. Miller fell to his knees, realizing his power was gone forever. Jean didn't kill Miller in front of Sarah. He signaled his men to take the broken man away to a deep, dark hole where the sun never shines. Sarah collapsed against the wall, the adrenaline finally leaving her body. Jean knelt beside her, pulling her into his chest. He smelled of gunpowder and expensive cologne, and she smelled of antiseptic and sweat. In that basement, surrounded by pipes and wires, they made a silent pact to leave the violence behind. The hour ends with the sun rising over the city. The hospital was saved, and Miller was officially declared missing. Jean stood on the rooftop with Sarah, looking out at the skyline. He handed her a folder. It was the deed to the hospital, but it wasn't in his name or hers. It was a non-profit trust dedicated to the city's poor. He told her he was stepping down from the underworld to run a legitimate security firm. He was changing for her, and she was finally ready to stop being the quiet nurse and start being the woman who owned her future. 1 year later, the hospital had become a beacon of hope, and Sarah was the chief of medicine. She was no longer the girl whose hair could be yanked. She was the woman who commanded the room with a single look. She still wore the silk hair ties Jean had given her that first night. Dr. Miller's name had been scrubbed from the walls, replaced by a plaque honoring the staff's bravery. Life seemed perfect, but in Sarah's world, peace was always a fragile thing. Jin's transition to the legal world wasn't easy. The ghosts of his past kept knocking. A rival boss from overseas arrived in the city, looking to fill the vacuum Jean had left behind. They didn't understand that Jean wasn't weak, he was just focused. When they tried to shake down the hospital for protection money, they didn't meet a mobster. They met Sarah in her white coat. She didn't call the police. She called Jean, who showed up not with guns, but with a team of the best lawyers and federal agents money could buy. The final conflict came when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news sent a shockwave through their world. Jean was terrified. He didn't know how to be a father without passing on his shadows. He spent nights sitting in the nursery he had built, staring at the empty crib. Sarah walked in and sat beside him, telling him that their child wouldn't be a boss or a victim. They would be whoever they chose to be. It was the final healing moment for a man who had only known war. On the day the baby was born, the hospital was surrounded by a wall of suits. Jin's former soldiers, now legitimate security guards, stood at every entrance. They weren't there to fight. They were there to guard the birth of a new era. When Jean held his daughter for the first time, he wept. The man who had once terrified the city was completely undone by a 6-pound girl. He looked at Sarah and realized that his real power didn't come from fear, but from the family they had built. The story circles back to the beginning. A young, arrogant intern was seen snapping at a junior nurse in the hallway. Before Sarah could intervene, she saw Jean, dressed in a simple sweater, carrying a diaper bag, stop the intern. He didn't threaten him. He simply leaned in and said, "In this hospital, we treat everyone with respect, or we don't work here. Do you understand?" The intern nodded quickly, humbled by the presence of a man he didn't even recognize. As the sun set on the final chapter, Sarah and Jean walked out of the hospital together, their child tucked safely in a carrier. They passed the spot in the ER where the chief surgeon had once yanked Sarah's hair. It felt like a lifetime ago. They weren't a nurse and a mob boss anymore. They were just two parents going home. The city hummed around them, oblivious to the war that had been fought for its soul.